What happens when you combine the most innovative, eccentric and charismatic leaders, disruptors and founders from tech, with the pedigree and history of one of the most established institutions within the City of London? The Searching for Mana podcast will be produced in partnership with the London Stock Exchange. I'm Lloyd, the host of Searching for Mana. We're going to be interviewing some of the leaders, influencers and disruptors in the tech space, where I'm going to be trying to dig in and find out what's their mana, their superpower, their magic. Welcome on to Searching for Mana, Robby.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today.
Pleasure to have you on the show. If you could be so kind to give a fuller introduction to the audience, very much with the context of, what you're up to right now with the Animoca Brands.
Sure, no problem. Well, as you know, we are fundamentally a games company, and I think we're best known as one of the largest games company in particularly the Web3 space. And as well, we're an investor, the most active investor in Web3, I think, still to date. And we have a portfolio of about 500 businesses across all aspects of Web3 when it comes to, infrastructure or content, etc. And, I spend most of my time actually looking at the investing side of the business. So we do that both strategically off the balance sheet, as well as through a venture capital fund and a private equity fund.
Thank you. So exciting. Why would a gaming company be interested in Web3?
Good question. A gaming company is interested in Web3, I think, for a very simple reason. Because if you think about the intersection of what Web3 does really well and what gamers have been habituated to do for more than a decade, the predominant business model of gaming is free-to-play gaming. So that means that players buy virtual currency and they spend that virtual currency on virtual items. And that kind of behavior, is really the de facto behavior of billions of gamers around the world. And so the idea of the usage of digital currency to buy digital assets is second nature to the 6 billion gamers around the world. And so we thought that this was actually the perfect way in which to introduce the benefits of blockchain and tokenization to this audience, because we don't have to explain to them the value of buying this virtual stuff. So we can essentially replace the in-game currency with a fungible token, like Ethereum, for example, or any other cryptocurrency. And we can replace the in-game content, or we can tokenize it, the playable content, as non-fungible tokens or NFTs. And that way, people can actually own the digital content in those games. Because I think the one piece of education that we've worked hard on over the last 5 or 6 years that we've been in this part of the business is to really help people to understand that in traditional games, and in fact in all of Web2, you don't really own the digital stuff that you pay for. You only rent it. You're essentially renting a software license, but you don't own it. So you don't have any of the financial benefits that come with actual legal ownership, where you can build asset value, you can trade it, you can dispose of it, you have actual agency and rights over it.
Thank you. You just mentioned a big number. So gaming broadly across the fray has 6 billion, what you could say, users, which I'm sure we can all believe. How many out of interest are in the Web3 space now? How many have converted?
So I believe, to give it a rough approximation, about 200 million people have come into contact with Web3 in any form. And this is not gaming. Gaming is a small subset of that. But the revenue from non-fungible tokens over the last, to give you some perspective, the gaming industry itself is about $200 billion a year. And that's, including all those 6 billion users. So, and half of that, probably a little bit more than half of that now is mobile. And then the rest is PC and console gaming. And in the Web3 community, what we find is that actually Web3 games tend to have much higher monetization and much higher retention than their Web2 counterparts. And the main reason is because of that factor of ownership. Because when you think about it, ownership is actually the best retention mechanism. Ask anybody who owns a vacation home when the last time they took a holiday somewhere else was. They will go to their vacation home because they own it, right? And ownership really is that as we call it in gaming, a re-engagement platform, right? Because you go back to it over and over because you own it.
Yeah.
And your approach to it is also very different in how you think about spending. And so, for example, you will spend more, furnishing a home you own compared to one you rent, perhaps, because you're doing it for your own financial benefit. You see it as an investment in your property. And so to go back to answering your question, of that 200 million users who are in Web3 at the moment, we estimate that there's probably anywhere from 20 to 50 million of those who have played games of any type.
Yeah.
But I think less important than the user numbers actually are the revenue numbers. So we saw last year around 30 billion in NFT revenues. And I think that speaks volumes, because if you think that the audience is on the order of tens of millions compared to billions in the overall game industry, and yet we're already at 10-15% of revenues.
Yeah.
And so I think, as a friend of mine who's a longtime industry stalwart said, he said, even if you really don't believe in Web3 as a thing, it's already 10% of the industry. So therefore, it's a niche you have to deal with, even if it doesn't grow any further. Like if you're the biggest naysayer.
So let's say that you're the reverse of that naysayer.
That would be me.
I can imagine.
Guilty.
And if anybody's not watching the video, anybody who's tuned in on audio, Robby has an amazing screen set up behind him where you're in some type of 3D visualization of the different games across
Yes.
the brands. It's awesome. I love to get to at some point talking through some of those, but just to stay on this thread because it's super interesting. As the reverse of the naysayer, as the champion of Web3 and this particular space, but actually now broadly across it, that is impressive to be able to say, okay, well, the existing much huger population that's engaged in gaming of kind has a revenue of 200 billion. We have NFTs at 30 billion. And what immediately springs to my mind is they're very, very close to what you're saying around how one would treat their property. There's a different emotion to putting up, wallpaper in something that you feel like is your own place, or where you feel someone else's. There's just a human sentiment around that right now.
Exactly. You don't want to do it for the benefit of your landlord, right?
Yeah, exactly. We talk about for an hour on that type of human psychology. It's fascinating. With NFTs, very much, I suppose it's less in many ways, not always, but like, let's say with digital art, somebody is thinking of it as an investment, as an asset class, largely. So I think a lot of money here has come into it where even that money was already in the system from people, and by that I mean in the digital asset space. And then individuals thinking, well, how do I live in this world? How do I start appreciating assets of my own in this world? But nonetheless, whatever, the numbers are unbelievable. So if 10% can do that, I would be trying to forecast, where's the seminal moment? Where's the moment where it's the crossing of the chasm, whether it's happened in your opinion or whether it's about to happen, where suddenly that swathe of gaming broadly all starts to come into wanting access to Web3 and digital assets in their game. Talk us through the timeframes and your predictions there, and perhaps the things that need to happen for us to get there as the champion of this space.
So I think there's a couple of things at play. The first one is that if we look back at the history of how the gaming industry has evolved, it tends to be when new platforms emerge that the kind of the leaders of those new platforms, the ones that end up being kind of having the most iconic titles and being the stalwarts of it, are often new to those platforms, as opposed to the ones who were the leaders of the prior platform. So if you look, for example, at the beginning of mobile gaming, we associate some of the most famous titles, things like Subway Surfers or Candy Crush, or hang on one second. So I think if you look at some of the most iconic titles of mobile gaming, everything from Angry Birds to Subway Surfers and Candy Crush, they were all developed by game companies who were largely unknown prior to mobile. And it was because they understood how to innovate on the platform. If you think back to Angry Birds, there were actually games in existence for several years on mobile prior to Angry Birds. People forget that Angry Birds only came out 3 years after the App Store originally launched. But the reason that everybody liked it so much was because it employed a swiping mechanic. And prior to that, game companies had been trying to build on mobile using sort of mechanics that were brought over from desktop, like virtual joysticks on the screen and stuff that didn't really work for the medium. So it took somebody who understood how to embrace the new medium to really innovate. And I think the same thing is going to happen in Web3. So first, to talk about that evolution, all of the big game companies, I think, will be unlikely to be the ones that will innovate in Web3, but they will take a more cautious approach and wait and enter the market, 5 years after it becomes mainstream, and they will make acquisitions. And then, of course, they will remain big companies, as they always do, but they will tend to come in a little bit later. And we saw that with mobile as well. I think that, the most exciting thing that pushes this change is thinking about how the ownership of property and the relatively frictionless way that you can make transactions happen in digital assets actually really benefits what we call the creator economy. And that logic applies here for game developers and content creators of any type. So the most important thing I think that I can highlight about that, roughly $30 billion of NFT transactions that I mentioned earlier is that over 90% of that revenue went to the creators of that content. And it didn't go to all of the IP holder. It didn't go to all of the platforms in the middle. It didn't go to distribution costs. It didn't go to, the App Store in that case, if you want to make the Web2 example. Whereas, as we all know, on mobile, if you sell anything through either of Google or Apple's storefronts, then 30% comes straight off the top before any other costs. And there are other costs associated. So I think because all of that revenue just goes essentially to the bottom line of the actual creators of the content, that's also going to be a huge driver, just because content creators see much higher margin in these markets.
Yeah, whilst the space has also provided unpleasurable seasons, but I've had the pleasure of seeing, as an example, artists who've come to the Web3 space and have, suddenly had what they've been looking for, which is an incredibly enthusiastic fan base. And the fan base is worth talking about, because certainly what, I kind of would speak to them around is, you're spending some serious money here on art. And if, like, we go back 2 years ago, were you walking around galleries buying art? And more often than not, that they wouldn't have. So what's the difference here? And I think what seems to be the feedback was, well, I actually know the artist now. I've got this direct, conversation with them. And maybe it's the difference between renting and owning again. It's like, it feels so special to have a piece of art when you understand the narrative behind it. Even better, you understand and perhaps like or admire the individual who is the artist and the creator of this. And of course, this of course, parallels in music or gaming or whatever it might be. But particularly for me, co-founder of Mana Lab, Mimi Nguyen, created a digital gallery. And so I was really exposed to a lot of this over the last few years. And it's just been a wonderful renaissance period for these individuals. And to your point, they're making incredibly healthy livings out of this. And they're all crazy fanatics who then just pump that back into other artists' work, which is fantastic to see. So you've got this beautiful community that just did not exist before Web3 for these individuals. They have their livelihood. They all have friends who are the type of friends that are wonderful to have, where you share passions and you support each other. And it's really been truly special. So I've seen that exact point that you're talking about. And that's, for me, God, if we can kind of roll this out as much as possible, where you've seen people in gaming communities previously find that collaboration and peer group that they're looking for distributed across the world, if they all kind of find purpose in the same game. Now, if you start having the ability, and you've seen it, where also, income can be supported through that, then you truly have a special situation. I'm not as familiar with gaming, Robby. If you could maybe talk us through any scenario there, it'd be great to hear.
I think your example is spot on. And if you think about it, it's not necessarily a new concept either, because Picasso and Braque and all these guys used to exhibit at the Salon in Paris, right?
Yeah.
And they would go and have dinner with their, as we call them these days, whale clients, right? And they would hang out together and wine and dine and create a personal relationship in person with their most cherished clients. And those were the people who were literally called patrons of the arts because they
Yeah.
were their patrons. And what we have now, I think, and what you've described is essentially the 21st century version of that, where, to put it in more bland marketing terms, we have a direct to consumer relationship. So it's essentially the artist creating that direct to client relationship without being disintermediated by gallerists and distribution, essentially.
Yeah.
And so we have the same thing actually now when we work with big brands, because I think, and this is where you're going to start to see a big sort of wave of consumer brands coming into Web3, because now they're also able to create that direct to consumer relationship. I think the most famous example, of course, being Starbucks, who decided to put their loyalty program on chain in the form of an NFT. And this allows them to really create a relationship directly with their customers on digital platforms. Because I think one of the concerns for brands, whether it's mass consumer or luxury goods, et cetera, is over the last 15 years or so, they have essentially lost all their customer relationships because those have been basically co-opted by Google and Facebook and Apple and the big tech giants, who now have taken all that consumer data and used their amazing algorithms to basically analyze all of that data and gain all that knowledge, but then hide behind GDPR and privacy and say they can't share that with the consumer brands. And so they keep all the benefit of that data to themselves. And so I think you see now brands wanting to really get a direct consumer relationship. And on the other hand, consumers wanting to have more agency over their privacy. They want to have more control over their personal data. And that's all consumers, but especially younger consumers.
Yeah.
And so I think that these trends are opposing forces on either end, squeezing big tech in the middle, where I think Web3 provides a wonderful solution because, if you want to have agency over your data, then it's great to have a direct relationship with a brand and say, look, I'm happy for this brand to have all my data because I love this brand. I'm a
Yeah.
big consumer and that's my choice.
How does this in the business wars start to pan out, given those big tech businesses are putting all their resource into making sure that they also equally own the Web3 space?
They're not actually. I think that they are, I mean, all big tech companies, I think, are exploring it. Web3 is a little bit subversive in the respect that most big tech companies, whether they're game companies or social media companies, all have Web3 enthusiasts and fans who work within those organizations. But I think that those companies, because Web3 is essentially, it's an open source software movement. So I think you can see the growth of Web3 in a not dissimilar fashion to the growth of Linux, where it's something that I think lots of people, especially more technical people within companies, really appreciate and love, but don't necessarily see how it fits into the core business. So it took Linux years for people to for corporates to get comfortable with the idea that they could use software that didn't actually come from a company, so to speak, because they wanted to hold somebody accountable, obviously, for services and things like that, which makes sense. You can understand how that's a risky bet for somebody running for a CIO or an IT department. But I think what happens is then you find people fill those gaps. So, companies like Oracle and SAP start to use those tools themselves and become those service organizations for those tools. Yeah. So I think that's what we will see ultimately, is that the big tech companies will start to employ more and more Web3 infrastructure internally, but they may do so quietly to preserve their existing business models. I mean, most people don't know that when you sign DocuSign, it uses the blockchain because they don't advertise it, but it's just a really efficient way to run their business.
Yeah. So this starts to take us into interesting business strategy, because I mean, at the top, I was going to ask, but the conversation went down the path it did. Well, why did you stop just being a gaming company
Mhm.
and employ this investment strategy, which clearly has,
Yes.
from an outside perspective, looks like it's gone very well. So I'd like to know, and I think probably useful for the audience to have some context around scale, but actually to the point that we're just thinking about, why strategically are you investing in anything other than just your own company would be interesting to know.
Sure. So the reason is very simple. It's because the thing that Web3 really excels at is the enhancement of network effects. And so when we think about what has made, everything from telecommunications networks originally to social media companies so impactful, it's been this idea of network effects, that the power of the business, the attractiveness of the service, the influence, etc., the amount of data you collect grows exponentially with the size of the network as opposed to linearly. And in fact, some people have posited that at supermassive scale, as we see with social media these days, you actually get not just a exponential as in to the power of 2, but it's like to the power of n. Because once you hit like this escape velocity, once you get to hundreds of millions or billions of connected users, where it just becomes so incredibly powerful as a result of all the connections that are made. So what happens is in Web3, because we tokenize all of our content and our value exchange, we can facilitate all of the exchange of these tokens across multiple, software applications. So in layperson's terms, it means you can take your stuff, whether it's your money or your game assets, from one game to another game to another game. But because it's tokenized, it's not just limited to games. So, if I buy a piece of digital art, I can take that tokenized NFT art and put it on the wall inside my virtual house, inside my game, because it all runs on the same token standards. And so if I can do that, then I can also take that piece of tokenized art and I can take it to a lending protocol and I can pledge it as collateral to get a loan, right, of cryptocurrency. And then I can use that in the game to buy more content, and I can use that content and I can pay back the loan for my art, and et cetera, et cetera. So all of these applications, regardless of the fact that they exist in a domain of gaming or art or decentralized finance, can all connect together. And it's because they can connect together that that's what drove our investment strategy. Because in fact, why shouldn't we support a DeFi lending protocol? Because actually they're going to be lending to our gamers, et cetera.
The central why for you now has got to, I want to see that moment where Web3 has those billion plus users and order of magnitudes of network effects occur? Or is it still, we want to create the greatest gaming experiences on the planet, or somewhere in the middle? Tell us the why and the mission.
The why and the mission. The why and the mission is actually far more abstract. The why and the mission is that we think capitalism is broken and we would like to fix it. And we think that this is one way that we can do this. So if you look at, demographic trends, one of the things that's quite unfortunate, and I think the US is a great example of this, and maybe to a lesser extent the UK, but we have tremendous income inequality, which has just basically been, towards more inequality steadily for the last 25 years, probably since about 1995, 30 years. And this increasing income inequality has actually, I think, disillusioned young people about capitalism. They think that capitalism is kind of the problem, right? But we would disagree with that. We don't think capitalism is the problem. We think actually this inequality is the problem, is sort of the root cause. So if you look at surveys of young people in America, young Democratic voters have been surveyed, and they tend to actually view socialism more favorably than capitalism now. And because they're blaming the organizational system of their government while not understanding that actually what's broken is that they're not participating in capitalism to the same extent that their parents were. And we think that some of this is due to this kind of feudal nature of how very, very large tech companies have taken control of the information economy. Because technology is by far and away, as we've been saying for 10 or 15 years, data is the new fossil fuel, essentially. Big tech companies are the biggest companies of our time. And they use all of our consumer data and information and benefit, as we talked about, from all those network effects. And they use their AI models and learning algorithms to glean all of this knowledge from the data they collect from us. But they don't actually share any of that knowledge with the consumers. So, as they always quip, when the service is free, then really that means you're the product. And so I think in this case, what we are interested in is how we can actually build a more inclusive form of what we call stakeholder capitalism that better aligns value distribution between all of the participants in the network. So for example, if you think about what we do in games, the creator economy, you essentially have the creators, you have the platforms, and then you have the investors. And in the Web2 model, it's really the platforms and the investors that accrue all the value, right? The users don't really accrue any value whatsoever. They use a service that's free, but essentially all the benefit, goes to the investors and the platforms. And you can see that in the fact that pretty much every large tech giant is now $1 trillion business, which is a number I still can't get my head around. But if you think about what happens in Web3, because of the scenario of it being much more efficient and everybody having a stake in the network. So for example, if you use a Web3 product that runs on Ethereum, you will generally require Ethereum tokens to participate in the product or in the project. And that means that everybody who owns an Ethereum token owns a stake in the network, right? And so that means that you have a piece of whatever it is that you're contributing your time and your effort and your data to, right? And so you can benefit from having a stake in the network. And that means that actually it realigns the value distribution between the investors, the platform, and the creators and the participants. And it makes it much more fair. And so we think that actually this will end up creating a lot more overall value as we move from kind of this era of sort of monarchic feudalism of technology to a more sort of democratic, distribution.
Well, congratulations, because you're working on something that truly has maybe the highest meaning, which we're always looking for in business and on this show, is when, you really find somebody who's aligned with something that's truly worth bringing and changing in the market. And I couldn't agree more. I very much, started to relate to financial technology and then Web3, because you can just see this uncorrelated kind of market where the effort doesn't necessarily distribute into the value that would feel fair. And it has really disengaged. You're probably right, say individuals coming out of education in the last 10, 15 years, just unbelievable. One of the Mana Group's core businesses is a search business. And so we, get sometimes the pleasure and sometimes the distress of really going through individuals, humans, talented individuals, drivers. And, most of these individuals very ambitious and went and got themselves, aspiring educations, and then are just completely lost in the markets right now. Just haven't found anything that feels like it's anywhere near purpose or like achieving the type of material value that you need just to have an okay life in an expensive city. And so what you got was big tech offering what at least looked like something that was mission driven and a comfortable kind of gold zone of, finance that you would get, but broadly speaking, having absolutely no kind of ownership over that organization. And I think loads of people became disillusioned with that over the last several years. And the pleasure of working in some really good, innovative spaces overall, but also in Web3, is exactly to your point, is some people who've come into it suddenly being aware, oh, wow, okay, this is it. Like, if we nail this, and if we hire more people, and if we create more value, and if more people come into this, this is the way that capitalism should distribute
100%.
value. So
100%.
I'm 1,000% with you on that. I want to ask a couple of questions, though. I find it very easy to go blame the individuals who created big tech, and
Mhm.
perhaps we could, but incentives drive behavior. So if we actually look a layer above that in the hierarchy, was it really the traditional venture capital model in many ways, and the incentive that was driven to those type of organizations? Create a moat around your business, you know,
Yes.
and all this type of conventional wisdom, which, by the way, goes and gets you a monopoly. So,
Yes.
if you're
So
Berkshire Hathaway, you want that to happen. But I'd love you to riff around that, because you're an
totally
investor, you
agree.
understand these power dynamics.
Totally agree. So I think that, two things. One is traditionally software has always been about building a moat. And that's literally going to be one of the first things any venture capitalist asks you when you're pitching during your fundraising pitch. They're like, so where's your moat, right? Because the expectation is that you'll be able to build this defensible wall towards, the barbarian invaders coming and poaching your users. And that mindset, which is, part and parcel of Web 2, has come from the fact that software has always been siloed. And so it's been viewed as a zero-sum game where, I have my users, and if you offer a similar product and get one of my users, they will never come back and you've stolen my user. And so my job is to essentially get as many users as I can, and they're like rats in a bowl, and you just keep pulling them back in as they try climbing out, right? And you have re-engagement campaigns and all this kind of stuff. And essentially, mobile is the perfect distillation of this because it's such an incredibly huge platform that you build these user acquisition funnels where you literally put in hundreds of millions of people at the top of the funnel, and really only a couple percentage of them come out the bottom and end up spending and being very loyal, high spending customers of yours. So the monetization actually is quite poor, but you need to plunge all those people through the funnel essentially to build a business. I think, though, the problem with that is that ultimately you end up pushing all of these businesses inevitably into what the economists like to call rent-seeking behavior, because they build out these monopolies and these moats, and then at that point in time, they veer off into two directions, or sometimes both at the same time. One is either laziness, because they realize that they can actually just start to cut costs and provide an inferior service and still extract the same revenue on that basis, and therefore higher margins. Or they decide just to keep increasing prices because they realize that consumers have no alternatives. And I can't help but pick on Uber for this one as a resident of London, only because in the last 6 months or so, I've personally noticed what I feel like is a tipping point, because I think, as many people will be aware, similar to Tokyo, London is legendary for the high cost of taxis. And so I think a lot of people were quite pleased when ride-sharing services first came out, because they were very price competitive, and it opened up a much wider market for consumers to be able to consume car services, because maybe black cabs were prohibitively expensive for a lot of people. But in fact, now we've seen that tipping point, I think, where Uber, as the dominant ride-sharing company, has gotten so much market share that they've started to raise prices. And now we can see that they're actually on par or more expensive than the taxi alternative. And the service has not necessarily gotten any better, and it's not necessarily trickled down to the drivers either. And those drivers are the equivalent of what I've been talking about in gaming as the creators in the creator economy, if you will. And so I think that this whole idea of building out those moats works for a period of time. And as you said, maybe we can hold venture capital as an industry accountable for some of that, because the period during which it works well is the 5 to 8 year holding period of a venture capital firm, where they will extract the most value out of those returns.
Yeah, I think it's probably another show if we really went into incentives in investment. This is again something that I'm very excited about, what we have in our space, with and really the starts of a few good investment DAOs, again, where
Mhm.
value is shared much more broadly, again, communities who are investing into things, and then again, as you say, a much higher proportion of who comes into the funnel actually achieving asset value, gives you some hope that at least, not that like human psychology, cycles don't repeat, and then you get these moments where, as you say, you know, freemium moments, you could feel like the Uber's cheap, but then you become the product and then suddenly it ratchets
Yep.
you up. So there's always kind of these cycles in the market, but you know, the line typically over time with human ingenuity goes up, and you suspect that things are going to rhyme, but perhaps at least the generation's going to have more distributed value. But like I said, we'll have to get you back on to talk around investment at some point. What I would love to do now is really go into some of your background, because what strikes me is just the level of thoughtfulness that you have in your approach. And I want to understand what goes alongside with that and how that's come around. You know, you've quoted some economic terms. It'd be great for us to really understand, like, what's the background, what's the foundations of, you know, perhaps intellectually and experience wise, how you developed into the leader that you are now. So to start with, you know, you don't need to walk through a CV or like the equivalent of a LinkedIn, God forbid, but whatever context you think is useful for the audience so we understand you more, Robbie.
Sure.
And perhaps to start with, if you could just go as far back as possible to set the scene as, you know, you
Sure.
as someone who started first thinking about who you might be in this world.
So I think, you know, I was first the beneficiary of what I'd call a classical education, meaning was very lucky and went to a nice university where we read lots of classics. And actually 3/4 of my university education was core curriculum as opposed to choosing a specialty. And I think that actually, if you're lucky enough to have that, does prepare you to think about things in a multidisciplinary fashion. At the time, I really wondered why I was reading Thucydides. I didn't get it, and I kind of hated it. But I think all that stuff, you know, in the round was good for me. It just took me 20 or 30 years to realize it. But I spent my whole career in what the bankers call TMT, so telecoms, media, and technology, and I've done all of them. And when I arrived at mobile gaming, you know, at the invitation of my longtime friend Yatsu, who's the co-founder of the business, I thought it was kind of the culmination of all the things that I had done before, because it's a combination of telecoms and internet and media, and that's what gaming is. It's a little bit of everything. It's very multidisciplinary. I thought it suited me. And also, I think when we think about how to build and scale businesses, you know, being involved in the growth of mobile content and gaming particularly, which is the biggest, you know, content sector within mobile since the early days, was really a treat, because it gives you an understanding of how to growth hack at incredible scale, because we've never had a platform in technology before for that. I mean, the way that mobile grew was much, much faster than the internet. And Yat and I were around, and we became friends in the 90s during the first, you know, Web 1 days in the mid 90s. And I think that it was a lot of that experience that prepared us for what we see in Web 3, because we see a lot of parallels between the adoption of, you know, Web 3 technology and blockchain wallets and people onboarding to digital assets now, in the same way that we saw web browser adoption and people starting to use the internet back in the mid to late 90s. So if you actually look at the number of blockchain wallets that are in use today, you know, that number, roughly that 200 million number that I cited to you, roughly correlates with the number of web browsers in usage in 1998. So if you want to draw parallels, we're kind of at a similar point in time where it feels like Web3 is a big thing. But then again, you know, is your aunt and your grandmother using it? No, they're not. And they weren't using the internet in 1998 either. And that's, you know, things like e-commerce. Amazon was around, but it was not a ubiquitous e-commerce platform for another 5 to 10 years after that. And so I think we're in a similar generational moment in Web3, but I think, you know, we just have the fortune of being middle-aged guys now with a few years under our belts. So we have some resources and some experience that we can see what we feel is coming down the road and are in a position to take advantage of it.
We think around the wisdom of teams, and be that distributed teams, and be that teams who are sat in funds or startups or whatever it might be. And I also think that there may well have been a vogue era of the Zuckerberg founder. Well, actually, I don't think that this is for sure, where, you know, the valley really focused on plucking out that Harvard grad and
Mhm.
putting all of the resources behind this person. And then really the press sees that there's this, you know, prodigal son. And I mean, in all those instances, like if you're going to take a Mark Zuckerberg, he's obviously outrageously impressive. But
Mhm.
the weight and support and teams around him obviously equally made that platform, if you believe it is successful, which in many versions it's tremendously, what it was. And so again, it's trying to think through what you've just talked to, which is, well, depending on what the project is, you know, are you looking for somebody who's completely chaotic of thought and can disrupt a space? Or are you thinking about bringing in an individual or individuals who have been through some cycles in something incredibly parallel?
Mhm.
And almost always what I see is the combination is where this is going to work best. But, you know, very much unlike in Japan, how a business might work, where people would
Yes.
certainly look at, this is the person who has the 20 years experience and the wisdom, and I'm happy to learn. And that's quite comforting in many ways. What I think also happened in our tech society was like, oh, well, I mean, if you don't have a unicorn by the time you're 28, like that's it. It's too late. Quit.
Yeah.
And I think that's really stressed a bunch of people out. And so some of the stuff that's nice to do on this show is to show all examples.
Yeah.
But really good to hear your journey there. And when you hear it, it reassures you, okay, I mean, this platform's probably in the absolute right hands because of all the wisdom that you've created over those years. And you know, the ability to stay actually agile of mind and innovative is
Yes.
the skill there with the wisdom, because a lot of people otherwise get stuck in conventional thinking. So
100%.
on that point, I'd love to know, and this is very much mental model value, how have you managed to, and I know it sounds rude, by the way, you know,
Mm.
I'm a middle-aged dude too, so I can say it, but how have you managed to keep such a innovative, fresh mind? And just to tee up the thing in a basic way, like, is it a lot of reading? Is it seeking out experiences? Are you spending time with certain people? Like, talk me through that, please.
Sure. Um, it's not terribly glamorous. I think, well, because you can, it's so easy to put on a show and be like, oh, well, you know, I read all of this stuff and but honestly, so much of what happens in life is just luck and good fortune. And I think being able to capitalize on it when it comes across, I think having experience prepares you more to recognize when you're lucky, maybe, and grasp particular opportunities that come across rather than ignoring them in pursuit of something else. And that's where experience may be a benefit. I think that the hardest part is, and I think of this when it comes to recruitment, particularly in our business, the hardest part is to find continue as we've grown as a business to find you want to find new people who are more and more, bring more and more depth of particular types of experiences into the business. But at the same time, the challenge with those kind of people is you're hiring them because they're really good at something, and yet you want them to do that, but potentially in a completely different way than they've ever done it before. So you want them for everything they know, but you want them to be open to forgetting it. And that's a very difficult combination, because I think the one thing that's a hallmark of anybody who's been in tech, who's a career, person, whether entrepreneur or employee, is that it's ultimately about survival. The technology business is unforgiving. It always changes, and it changes quickly. And that's actually one of the big draws, for people like myself. I love the fact that it changes and there's something new around the corner all the time. And frankly, if you look at what's going on in AI these days, it's like the perfect example. There's literally a generational change of upgrade of technology every 3 months or so, really. And I think that it forces you to be very adaptable, and it forces you to kind of, reinforce, I guess, the plasticity in your brain, and try to think and keep an open mind about stuff all the time. Because I think that's actually the death knell of any tech businesses, when you really think that you just know it all, and you're going to just keep doing that. Because if you've been paying attention at all, you should know in your own industry that everything will change and somebody's going to disrupt you. And there's going to be a 20-year-old kid who takes your job in 5 years because that's how this industry works. And so you have to be open to that fact. And as you get older, the hardest part is listening to those younger people with less experience than you, because they actually may know more about what's going on now than you do. Which is why, just a funny anecdote, you'll notice that if you ever look at the part of the game industry that caters particularly to younger audiences, to kids, what you'll notice is that all the developers who run those game companies all tend to be in their mid-30s to early 40s, because their kids are the demographic, which is why they went into that business, because they have a focus group at home that informs how they think about the product.
Oh, that's so interesting. Robby, we're going to now move into the quick fire Mana round,
Okay.
where I'll just ask you a few specific questions we always ask every guest. So to start with, if you could have the front page of your favorite publication, so we'd like to know also what that is, what would you put on it?
What would I put on it? Well, I have to say, to be honest, these days, the only traditional print publication that I read all the time is I read The Guardian, because I really like the journalism. And what would I put on it? I'd just like to see some good news for a change, if you really want to know the honest truth.
That's amazing. Yeah, if I completely agree. What would that good news be?
I think the good news would be, I feel like as a resident in the UK, I feel like, the country's had a challenging time since the financial crisis, and it would be nice to see some political leadership that I think gave the population hope, because I think they've lost hope for a while. Unfortunately, in my, childhood home of the US, I think that the same problem exists, where, the political leadership has just not been very inspirational for a while. And it's not dissimilar to financial markets. Investors are happy to invest when they have hope and they think that things are improving. But then we get bear markets because people lose hope. And I think the same thing happens in politics and society.
Yeah, again, a whole other show. I'm not going to go into that more. And I don't mean drinking coffee here, but what keeps you up at night?
So one of the things you have to understand if you get involved in Web3 is, it's especially when it comes to having a product that involves tokens that are live and freely traded, is that the markets for those tokens are 24 hours a day. And so if you pay too much attention to the prices of those tokens, they can literally keep you up all night. And you start to wonder whether it's a good idea that financial markets actually close for a period of time during the day, just to give everybody some time off.
In the history books, surely it's going to be like, and in 2025, they realized that these markets should close so that people can sleep.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I'll get behind that one. That's the type of movement that will get me into politics. This is what's going to change the hope of the nation, is some individuals like you, Robby, with, genuine thoughtfulness and good ideas, like shutting the crypto markets so people can sleep, into power.
Exactly.
Do you have a particular ritual? It could be in the morning, it could be in the evening, it could be both, but that is really important to you, and the type of thing that we all hear about, people having cold showers or whatever. And I mean, I have it and I really like it. I'm into these type of things. You might not be, you might be. Is there a particular ritual that really, with all the pressure that you go into in a given day, and to make sure it's not stressful, that it's constructive, that really grounds you?
It's kind of boring, but I like to run. And it's one of those things that started out in childhood, because I was a little bit overweight as a teenager, and it just stuck as a lifetime habit. But I think that it's a good opportunity to think about stuff. But also, frankly, I really enjoy it because there's some great podcasts and content that I like listening to, and it gives me some private time to just spend half an hour, educating myself on something random, not necessarily related to my work. And at the same time, I actually find I feel physically so much better. I've come to learn about myself in the last 6 or 7 years that I will actually feel better foregoing an hour of sleep during the day, even though I don't sleep as much as I probably should anyway. But I will actually feel better exercising instead of having that extra hour of sleep.
What you're doing then, you're running for about half an hour and you're listening to a podcast, and
Yes.
you've got a nice route or two. You go round a park or
Yeah, no, I'm really lucky. I live near a big park, so
yeah. What's a recent podcast that you listen to?
I have to say my favorite at the moment is the one called The News Agents, which you might be familiar with
No,
Emily
I'm not.
Maitlis and John Sopel and Lewis Goodall from formerly of Newsnight and the BBC. So I think they've tried to, put together a really short digest of things about the news, but do it in a way that is based upon being, senior BBC journalists for so many years, but at the same time, maybe with a little bit of, let's just call it more freedom than they had on the BBC.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds great. We'll put that in the show notes. I'd love to kind of digest that on a. It's daily.
Yes, it
Yeah.
is. But the fun part is they were so senior. Well, because as you know, Emily Maitlis did the infamous Prince Andrew interview, and John Sopel used to run the US desk. So, so they have tremendous access as well. It's not just your everyday podcast.
Yeah. Yeah. Fantastic. That sounds super cool. Is there a particular passage? It could be a book, but it could be a passage or it could be a mantra that's really dear or important to you.
Um, Good question. So there's a Chinese proverb I always think about, only because it's always challenged me, which is that one who knows others is wise, but one who knows himself is enlightened. Because I feel like, I'm not going to say middle-aged anymore. As a guy who's past 50, I still struggle with understanding myself. I think it's a lifelong journey.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I love it. That's superb. So you're obviously on the Searching for Mana show. Just to give context to you or anyone else who doesn't know what mana means, it is your magic, it's your essence, it could be your soul. So we starting to try to build out the thinking around this, because fundamentally I have a similar mission to you, but feel like we can contribute to it through connecting talent, but not just generally connecting talent to other talent, but as in, to your point, connecting talent with what their mana is, because this is what really people are searching for most of the time. So you have a hard mana and you have a soft mana, we think, anyway, and many more, but let's keep it there for now. Hard may well be that you're an engineer, for instance, and soft might be that you feel like you're somebody who has a great depth of empathy. And that would be a fantastic combination. For Web3, not for Web2. So just to set the scene, mana is your magic. Robby, what would you say your mana is?
I think I'm reasonably good. I guess I would have said that the best word to describe it would be collage. I loved to try my hand at things artistic when I was younger in school. Not to become an artist, but I always loved to take an art class on the side, and I was rubbish at it because I have very little manual dexterity. But I always enjoyed doing collage because it didn't require manual dexterity. It was just about ideas. And it was something that, where my skills could match my imagination a little bit more. And I think that I've carried that approach into how I approach working and relationships. So I think one of the things that I've developed as a skill is the ability to put disparate and seemingly unconnected pieces together, whether it's businesses or people or ideas, to try to, make interesting things happen. So I think it's really, it's important. The most important thing I think that I've learned is to figure out what you're good at and what you can do and contribute, and most importantly, what you can't, and what maybe is a waste of your time and others to do. As somebody who, has been involved in lots of businesses, it took a long time for me to admit to myself that I'm a terrible manager. And because that's not something that's usually associated with people who start companies, but it's, as we grow as a business, one of the best things we did was to hire great managers to run people, because that's not my skill. But if you want idea generation, if you want, maybe the occasional inspirational leadership, if you want business development, selling, I'm a pretty good salesman, but managing people day to day to meet timelines of completing, like production line timelines, not my best skill. And I'm old enough to admit that, but I've become much more valuable to the organization, not trying to do that part of my job, because that's not where I'm best suited.
Yeah, it really takes such a maturity of ego to start thinking around yourself and skills like this. And it's so interesting to see when you're talking to people who haven't found that yet, just how many people haven't found that and how important it is to try to. And I'm not saying it's an easy thing, but really when you, again, back to that point, when you get young leaders who do really well, they often have. And it's a whole other podcast around education and what really needs to happen there.
Yes.
And so much of education, and it sounds like you are fortunate to have that multidisciplinary experience, which is valuable when you're a person who's putting, tapestries together as you are. But how, where's the education that's teaching people about themselves, and not from a, complete lefty perspective, but from a, okay, how can I be successful if I want to be? How do I understand where I should lean into trying to correct something if it's valuable? How should I understand, actually, that's a skill that takes my energy away. I'm never going to enjoy doing that just because people say that that's a good career. I've now found out it's not for me. And I really think there's a lot of work to do here. And, hopefully Web3 and potentially gaming could be the solution here, where people are able to start build those type of skills. As someone I've got a 5-year-old daughter, I'm really hoping that, her formal education will be one thing, but there will be experiences that allow her when she's in her 20s, not to make more money, but to be in a career that gives her energy and doesn't take it away, because that's really when people have got a great career.
Yes. Well, and I think also there's a lot to be said for, as Simon Sinek, if you might be familiar with him, says how to find your why, right?
Yeah.
Because that's often how you really inspire people to get the best out of people, is to give them that purpose. Because as you'll find, you meet a lot of entrepreneurs, and it's a very hard and thankless road often, and it requires putting in long hours, and people need to have a passion for what they do, whether they love the product or they love the mission or they love the culture and the people they work with. There needs to be something besides just, punching the clock and getting a wage for it, to inspire people to really do their best.
That's absolutely right. Robby, we've taken a fair amount of your very valuable time. So I'm just going to ask 2 more questions. Actually, 1 question, but two things for us to discuss. Firstly, if you could really talk to any of or a particular game specifically right now that you're excited about. I know that, recently we were talking previously about you've made quite a big breakthrough on the platform with the ability to take assets across various games. You can talk about that if you want, or a particular game, just something that's current.
Sure. So I think one thing I'm excited about, because I'm a little bit of a petrol head as a personal hobby, we have something that we just announced a few weeks ago called the Motorverse. And the idea behind the Motorverse is essentially creating a hub for people who just love stuff on wheels, whether it's bikes or cars. They love racing, they just love driving. And so what it is, it's an interconnected suite of games. And we've created vehicle standards, tokenized vehicle standards, so that you can buy your cars as NFTs. So you own them, they're your cars, but you can use them in many different game environments. And the important thing is that it's not just the ability to use them in multiple games, which obviously Web3 enables, but the purpose of it is not for us to just make all those games as well. This is not about, an Animoca Brands ecosystem. It's about creating some standards for which we can put our games forth, but also then connect them with other people's third-party games that also use the same kind of token standards. So we're not just presenting our own games, but we're also working with lots of other developers who will adapt the same standards And then that means that our cars will be usable in their games, their cars will be usable in our games, etc. And that is why we ended up calling it the Motorverse, because it's the idea that, as a consumer, once you buy a car, you want to be able to drive your car everywhere, right? It doesn't make sense for for Ford to tell you you can only drive your car on Ford roads. You should be able to drive it anywhere. And the same thing should be true in the digital world.
So, just out of interest, if I want to go and buy a car there today, I can do that. This is live.
It is live, although
Yeah.
although I'm going to caveat that, like all tech projects, it's a work in progress. So it's live, but we're building it out piece by piece. So
Yeah.
we have a handful of different experiences. We have MotoGP themed motorcycle racing games. We have Formula E themed racing games, and then we have our core. We have drifting games, and we have something called Rev Racing, which is like just a general racing game.
And you can buy the cars already?
You can, yep.
And how's that going? People started buying them?
Yes, they have. But we just announced the knitting of it all together. So they've been separate Web3 games over the last 2 years, and now we finally have the umbrella in which to put it all together. Because figuring out how to get everything to work with each other was the hardest part, and that took us a couple of years.
Yeah, no, of course. Oh, amazing. Again, I'll put in the show notes so people can explore. Sounds phenomenal. And then just lastly, again, it's not really a question, but always like to give the guests the opportunity just to have the platform to, really set the horizon, the Web3 version of Hollywood outcome of, we've heard why you're doing this. What does it look like? What in your mind, Robby, is the vision that you're working towards and excited about?
The vision is very big. I think that I foresee the game industry adopting Web3 standards overall. I think that will greatly increase the breadth and scale of the industry. I mean, we've already, with the adoption of mobile as a platform, the game industry already moved from 100 billion to 200 billion in revenues in the span of about a decade. I don't see why that wouldn't at least double further with Web3, because what you're doing is essentially bringing in lots more people. Don't forget that you've got still another billion or two in the world who are not gaming yet and who are not part of the global financial system. And also, I think what this will do is it will result in a kind of Cambrian explosion of content. Because if you think there are a lot of apps in the App Store now, imagine if you don't need to have the App Store as a platform and you can essentially just make games and sell them at high margin directly to customers. The difference is that means that you can actually make a living off of games that have smaller audiences because the margins are much higher. So you're going to see an explosion of products that have audiences of hundreds or thousands as opposed to millions, because the monetization rate is much higher. So if you go back to what you were saying about your friends who are artists who have direct relationship with their customers, imagine the same scenario, except the product is a game instead of a piece of art. But yet the community that's formed and the relationship of content creator and customer is similar. And again, because the platform allows them to have a monetization rate of, let's call it 90%, it means that you don't actually need to have massive scale to actually have a great business. So you're going to see a huge explosion of what I would call small businesses.
Yeah, so exciting. I completely agree, as everybody who listens to this show would know, but I also just believe that, there are going to be companies and leaders who need to create that vision. So that's why I do everything in my power too, because it solves some of the biggest problems, on the planet right now. If we can take away these moats from these few vast monopolies, and like we were saying with the artists, put that relationship back to people earning fairly the value of their output. And I do believe this is happening. Lots of work to do. So look, Robby, really loved you being on the show. Thank you so much for all of your really open insights and talking through your journey. We could do several more shows. Such an interesting platform you've created. Massive congratulations. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you for having me. It's been a great chat.
Thank you for joining us on this episode. We hope you've enjoyed it. Please leave a like and a review and subscribe to our iTunes channel to stay up to date with the newest content. Find us on social media at Searching for Mana. Tell us who you want next on the show. Thanks again, and see you next time.